Good morning. Question for you. How do you know who you are? Like, do you have a good idea of who you are? There is science behind helping you figure out who you are because sometimes you can think you know who you are until certain circumstances come. But I don't know if you've been in a job or part of an organization or like a cohort or something that what they have you do is fill out these personality assessments. You know, these DISC or Myers-Briggs, there is, Working Genius. It seems like there's so many of them. If you want to get really scientific, you can also go to BuzzFeed. You can find out what Disney princess you are, what character of whatever show that you like. Really, real scientific ways to find out who you are. Am I Moana? There's opportunity. I think, though, one of the best ways to find out who you are as a person, though, is when pressure is applied. Like, I wonder if you're an employer, if you took a new employee and you wanted to figure out who they were, I think one of the best ways of doing that is probably 3 days before Christmas, putting them in a vehicle in a parking lot at West Edmonton Mall. How do they handle that pressure? What is coming out of them? When things don't go your way, when, you got deadlines, when there's stress, what are you like? Should I ask your spouse? Should I ask your kids? Who are you? Pressure has this way of helping you find out who you are versus who you think you are. My brother-in-law, he invited me to go golfing this past summer with him. And I haven't golfed for, probably 12 or 13 years. So you can imagine that I'm awesome. And he took me out to Sturgeon. It was free and it was like way too fancy for me. But I went, and I've always thought of myself as being a fairly patient person, not very competitive, kind of keen. I can keep my emotions in check. And, I say golf, but it was mostly landscape displacement therapy. That's mostly what it was. And I was amazed at how frustrated I got at golf. I mean, I'm telling myself, I'm having these internal conversations. Thomas, you've not golfed in a really long time. You shouldn't expect to be really good. But there's also this other side of me. It's like, why am I not being good? There was a few times where I wanted to slam the club, and I thought, maybe I'm actually an angry person. Maybe I'm not patient. Maybe who I thought I was is not who I am. I was thinking about when me and Catherine were dating, and I'm going to share the story because I was reminded of it this week. And I'm going to share the story, and I'm going to be honest with you. It is amazing that I married anyone. But I took her on a date. We were just dating, and we went to go see a concert. And something about me is I don't like being in a car in a long line. Or in long lines in general. I just get very anxious, all those things. And we were at a concert, and you know that after every concert, the artist goes off, and what happens? Encore, encore. And they come and give a great, great thing, right? So you're just waiting for it. I lean over to Catherine, I'm like, we should go. What do you mean we should go? We should go. But there's an encore, yeah. And no one's in the parking lot. We could get out. And she looked at me like, are you serious? I was like, dead serious. And we left, and honestly, like to this day, she's like, I can't believe you made me do that. But pressure has a way of showing who you really are versus who you think you are. That's the strange thing. Pressure has this way of just like squeezing what you try to hide. It's like this Jekyll and Hyde situation. That's what pressure does. That's what it's meant to do. In this passage, we have people under pressure, and it doesn't seem that way. Maybe you're just joining us and you've not knowing that we've been going through, the book of John for a while now. Or maybe you are, and you get to this passage and it almost seems like it's so different than what we read last week. And so I want to give you a bit of a background. So at this point, Jesus is invited to this meal to honor him because previously he had just raised Lazarus from the dead. He was dead for 3 days. Mary and Martha, his sisters, had sent word, and Jesus came, and we get this idea that he wept and he felt the emotion of all that was going on, that loss. And then he raised him from the dead after 3 days. And so, of course, they put this dinner on honoring Jesus. It was between, this death and resurrection of Lazarus, but what's happening and what Jesus knows at this point is that he's only about a week away from his own death, where there's going to be an unjust trial, where he's going to suffer, where he's going to die. So you have this Jesus under this intense pressure, knowing of what's coming. He's being followed by many people, and at this point, he knows people are hunting him down. So, between Lazarus and this text, there's probably a week or two where he kind of like hid. But he's coming out, and people are following and making noise, so it's going to be easy to find him. He knows at this point that he's going to be betrayed by one of his closest companions, but he's also going to be abandoned by all the disciples at some point. There is a lot of pressure at this point. And so you have this story of Mary, and what does she do under pressure? Well, we read she responded in this incredible form of gratitude. It says that, we read that this pint, and it was worth about $20,000 to $30,000 in today's money, and just lavishly poured it all over Jesus. And there was this pressure for her because, honestly, the other disciples, the other men especially, are just like, she could be thinking, what are they going to think about this? What are they going to say about it? It says that she washed his feet with her hair, and at that point, women, their hair were like crowns of glory. It was one of those things. It was like one of the most wonderful things, and to have it let down would have seemed a little bit not normal in that culture. But she does it anyways, and she washes what would have been considered the most unclean part of the human body, which is Jesus' feet. Because Middle East, walking with sandals, you can imagine, gets dirty. Only servants did that. And Mary, under all of this, she just took this moment and just responded in this incredible act of generosity, this incredible act of gratitude. Then we have Judas. And we see how he responded. He rebukes Mary. He's basically like, Jesus, that we could have sold this. We could have done something with this money. And I think right off the bat, I think most of us are like, actually, that kind of makes sense. Wouldn't you want to do? But we read, again, he didn't actually care about the poor. What Judas is more concerned about is if we sell that, I have more money to take for myself. There is this pressure around Judas because all these religious leaders were looking for Jesus. And so there's sense of if they're looking for him, they're probably looking for me too. And if he's not safe, I'm probably not safe. And then there's this pressure of the greed in him, of what he's done and what he wants to take. Maybe his reputation, but under all that pressure, we read that Judas buckled under it. What came out of him was the fact that just a few days down the road, he's going to literally sell Jesus for about $1,000. And so the worth to him of Jesus was just $1,000. And you read the story and really, you think it's really about these two people. And honestly, it kind of is. You look at Mary and you get an idea of what it looks like to show gratitude towards God. What is kind of declaring who God is. What does that look like? You get from Judas this idea of how does someone who was close in proximity with Jesus over the last 3 years, saw him do incredible things, but his heart grew so cold, he ended up selling Jesus based on this pressure and based on his greed. There's so much to learn in there. But the more I walked over it, the more I read through it, the more I prayed over it, what really kind of came out was that there was this third person involved, and it was Jesus. We get a good look at what Jesus is like under incredible pressure. Listen, at this point, at this meal, there is no one under more pressure than Jesus. There's no one else who's being hunted, who's going to be betrayed, have an unjust trial, who will suffer and who will die. This was all looming on Jesus at this point, at this meal. How would you respond under that pressure? How does Jesus respond? Who is he at the core when life is being squeezed? And I think it's important because I've heard, maybe you've heard, I've said, maybe you've said, my concerns are too little for God. He's got a lot going on. Yeah, I'm looking for a job, whatever, but I know there's people somewhere out in the world who are dealing with some intense things. How could God even care? He must be so busy. And you get this Jesus who is incredibly busy and under so much pressure. And what do we see in this story? What do we see about Jesus? Who is he? And we see that first. We find a Jesus who cares. When you walk into someone's house, one of the easiest ways to find out what they care about is looking at the pictures that are hanging on the wall or at the fridge. What's there? Maybe you see pictures of their kids, you see pictures of different things, maybe you see, like painting that their children did, and it's terrible, but it's their child and they love it, and it's wonderful. You see things they care about. We have these family friends in Red Deer we're really close with, and you walk and their fridge is just like tons of pictures of other people's kids. They have this absolute huge ability to care, and their home is always open. It doesn't matter how busy they are. They're like, yeah, come over, stay over, eat our food. Like, they're just so wonderfully caring, and you walk in and you see that, right? Or when you walk into someone's house and they have like all those kids that they sponsor from different countries, and you're like, wow. And you think, I sponsor kids, 3 of them, they're my own. They talk a lot about how much they suffer, and they cost more than $1 a day, but I have kids that I sponsor. But to be honest, you go into those and you see all those things, and it's infectious when you find yourself around people who just care so deeply about other people. It's encouraging. Sometimes it's challenging. Oh man, I wish I could care so much. When you walk into someone's house and you see those things, you get a good idea of what they care about. So I want you to imagine that you're in this story and you're walking into this dinner where Jesus is. What would you see? Who would you see? It's telling in the story of Jesus and who God is, because what you're going to see is first Lazarus, who just a little while before was dead, and Jesus brought back to life and restored him to his family. Not in John, but in another gospel, you read that this actually happened in Simon the leper's house. Now, if you were a Jewish person, which Jesus was and the disciples were, you would never go into a house of a leper unless he was fully healed and restored. And so we have Jesus going to the home of a leper who had been healed and restored. Simon the leper is at the table. You get Mary and Martha, who are the sisters of Lazarus, who just experienced this incredible feat of Jesus bringing their brother back from the dead, restoring them back to relationship. I mean, the home would be filled with evidence of how much Jesus cared for them. In fact, as we read, we see that this was a meal, like I said, to honor Jesus for this incredible act that he did. Because you can't be with Jesus and not be cared about. And all this pressure, all these things he can be worried about, where do you find him? You find him in a room with the people he cared very deeply about. Because Jesus cares about the things that you care about, the things you worry about. The problems that you face, the circumstances that you find yourself in that make us ask, is anyone there listening? What we have in this story, as you walk in to this room, you begin to say that you walk with a Jesus who cares deeply about what you care about. That's what you see. And it's also here that you see that Jesus, not only is there a history of the past ways he's cared, but there's a present way. Mary is rebuked by Judas after all these things he did, and what do you see Jesus do? He defends Mary. Judas, leave her alone. She is pouring her heart and genuine gratitude. Just close your mouth. Stop. He defends Mary, and to be honest, what Mary did would have been a bit scandalous. Jesus doesn't care. He sees this honest thing and gift that Mary's doing. He says, Judas, leave her alone. See, under pressure, Judas really cared about what he got out of it, to the point where he even shamed Mary for his benefit. He didn't care about the poor, he didn't care about Mary, about Jesus, as much as he cared about what he got out of it. Mary, in contrast, didn't care about what it cost her. Why? Because she cared about what she gained, her brother back. And so Jesus' primary care for her, that precipitated this incredible show of gratitude. Jesus cared about all of them here. In every life in that room, there's a story of his attentiveness, of his activity in their coming and their going, in their circumstances. Jesus cares about you. He cares about what you care about. He's attentive to you. He's attentive to me. And so it seems, is he too busy? But we get in the story, the most pressure he is going to face as he goes to it, and then you see this again on the cross, is that Jesus cares. The second thing we see at this dinner is that Jesus is incredibly generous. Now, it's interesting, because maybe you're asking, well, at first glance, it seems that Mary's the one that's being super generous. I mean, here we have a 30,000, sacrifice that she's made right before him. this lavish action, and then washed his feet with her hair. And yes, it is about her willingness to see who Jesus is, to recognize what he's done, that nothing can compare to what he's done for her. But there's something that I actually want us to notice, and I think is actually fairly easy to miss in this story. I want you to think with me first, what motivated her action of extreme service? It was first Jesus' incredible generosity by bringing her brother back to life. She wouldn't have done that unless Jesus first moved and was generous with her. And you see this actually kind of throughout Scripture. You know, you go to the Old Testament and you hear about tithing, this sense of the first of everything, and you give a bit. And when you actually read about it, what you read is Jesus or God speaking to his people going, hey, give a tenth. I want you to remember who gave you the ability to work and make money. And at first I read that, it's like, oh, that sounds like, hey, listen, I gave you the ability to work, you better give back. But that's not what God's saying. He's like, I have given everything to you. And I'm asking a little bit back. Why? Because this tithe went to what was called the storehouse, which was able to supply for the needs of many. He even said, keep a portion of your field for those who are wandering, the foreigners, those who are poor and needy. Keep a section of your fields for them. Why? Because God is generous. And so before Mary did anything lavishly, Jesus already gave something of greater worth than that ointment. But it doesn't end there, because we read, it was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. Jesus, like I said, was about a week away from being arrested, from being tried, from being crucified, and buried. Mary and no others in that room had any idea of what was going to happen in the next few days. But what we have is this nard was actually used for burial. It was in order to make sure that the bodies didn't stink like death. It was a way of honoring a body. And she had no idea what was going to happen. Maybe she was thinking, well, whenever he dies, this is just a way of saying he is a very different person. I'm setting him aside. That's what anointing kind of means. But what she doesn't know is that in a few days, he is literally going to be killed. And her act of generosity will actually return back to her, because what happened when he died and rose again? He gave her life again. He gave you life again. So not only did he give her a reason to have great generosity, not only was he generous first, but even when she gave something up, in this weird economy of God, I will return it in a greater way to you. It will be worth a lot more. And you know what's interesting? Even though Judas, we read, didn't receive the grace and life of Christ's death and resurrection, Jesus died for Judas as well, despite being betrayed. This is the incredible generosity of Jesus. He's just about to give his life away, and yet he's still thinking, what else can I give? And I think what we get from here is that when you give of your time, when you give of your resources, when you give of your efforts, maybe you feel like Jesus is asking you to give something out. Maybe it's something personal. Maybe it's greed. Maybe it's, this sense of like control over your own life. Whatever it is, what we have here, out of a genuine understanding of who God is and what he's done, when we give, God has this way of taking it and using it in a way that affects more than you could ever do on your own. I'll give you an example of this. So many of you know that we've been running Alpha every single week. We're coming to our 5th week. Alpha is really interesting because we ask people to be table leaders. And Alpha, is, if you don't know, is just a way for people to explore Jesus and the faith, just in a really open discussion. It's not like something where we give answers. You can just discuss it. But it requires table leaders. And table leaders are awesome because they need to give up about 10 to 12 weeks of their life. Every single Wednesday, they come out, they help set up. They are in discussion with strangers they don't know. And they're processing some of the information. They're praying for them. They're thinking about them. They're watching the videos. They give a lot of their time. It costs time, comfort. It costs energy. They can be doing a lot of other things. What's really neat about it is that one of our table leaders that are serving this fall was at the very first Alpha that ever started here in Edmonton, which has happened here at Central. And that's where his life was transformed, was at that Alpha. And I know that the table leader who was at their table a long time ago would tell you it was worth every cost for me to be there if it meant that someone's life was transformed. Because that's just what God does. When we give something out of this response to what God's already done, there's this recognition that he's always the first mover. He's always been first generous. But the other thing is that God will use it in a way beyond our own capacity. And what's really neat, we read that Jesus is generous. He wants us to give from a thankful heart, meaning he wants you to give from a reason, from gratitude. But we read that the aroma filled the room and everyone stunk like Mary's service. And here's the thing, people are affected by our kindness, by our willingness to lose our life for the sake of what Christ has for you. People are affected by it. Lastly, we read Jesus isn't rushed. Like I said, we're told it's about a week before Passover when he would be arrested. And what's really interesting is just so you know, I've never been arrested. Put you at ease there. I've never been arrested. But I think that if I knew I was going to be arrested, especially unjustly, I would really think about what I want to do with the last few days of my life. A couple of years ago, I was asked to write my own eulogy. And you're like, that sounds pretty depressing. And you'd be right. It kind of was. But I will say this. People had a lot of nice things to say about me when I wrote my own eulogy. But write your own eulogy. And the interesting thing is it got me thinking, what would I do with the last few days of my life? Who would I want to spend time with? And you would think that Jesus, knowing what's going to come up, he would be very particular about these last few days, that he would, get his affairs ready. He would be stressing about these religious leaders that were literally looking to kill him. Why would he be at this table with these people? You think that he'd at least go to Disneyland like one more time, right? Just to get a couple rides in, just feel it out, right? But that's not where we find him. We don't find him doing any of those things. What we find is that he is where he wanted to be, and that was being with his people. He cared about them. He was generous with his last moments of his life. Why? Because he just wanted to be among them. So many reasons why he probably should have been anxious and rushed. But he wasn't. He just chose to be there. I feel like it's easy for us to think, like I said, that God is way too busy with bigger things to worry about. But here we have Jesus about to face execution, not rushed, but present with us. And it gives a little insight as to why Jesus said this to Judas, you will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. It's not saying that Jesus didn't care about the poor. What he's saying is this, listen, your responsibility is to care for the poor. They're always going to be with you. But what he's saying is, in this moment, he's alluding to the fact that Judas was missing what was going on here. He was prioritizing being with us before asking us to do anything. It reminds me of another meal where Mary and Martha were at. And Jesus comes and Martha's cooking in the kitchen. And she kind of peeks around the corner. She's like, Jesus, do you want to tell Mary to get off her butt and help me in the kitchen here? Come on. And I love how Jesus responds. He responds with this kind of compassion and this relational way. He says, Martha, Martha. The Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed. Or indeed, only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. I think it feels like what God wants us to do is just all this activity, but what you find is Jesus actually prioritizes being with you, being present. He wasn't rushed. He wasn't too busy. He was inviting them to be as present to him as he was to them. In Matthew 6, Jesus teaches us how to approach God by teaching us how to pray. And he says, I want you to pray this way. And he starts with this, our Father. The word father is used is actually one of the most intimate forms that you could use. It's Abba. And the idea is a dad who cares about you, who wants to protect you, who wants to provide for you, who invites you to kind of come close and be near because he wants to be with you. And you know what's funny? Nowhere in Scripture do you ever find God calling you adults in God, seniors in God. He calls us children of God, sons and daughters. And Jesus says, when you approach God, approach him like you would a good father. And we find this in Jesus, that he is intimate. He's caring about them. He's protecting them. He's present with them. He's waiting for them. He's generous with them. Listen, there's a million things Jesus should have been stressed about and caring about. But where do we find him? When the pressure's on, what he most wanted to do was to be present with them, to be present with you. Jesus is not rushed. Jesus cares about you. And Jesus is generous. So what does that mean for us? What does it look like for us now? Here's some on-ramps for you. Things to process and think about. As we think about who Jesus is and who we are in light of him, what does that mean? Well, here's the invitation. First is this: where do you need Jesus? The one who cares to meet you. Is there something that you feel like, I don't know if I can bring it up. I don't know if I'm allowed to bring it up. And what we find is everywhere Jesus went are people following him who he cared about, who he touched. He did something. What does a God who cared for you mean to you? What can that mean for you today, this week? Second thing is this. It's for us to take time and recognize what he's given you already. And what you can be thankful for. I don't know, maybe it's family, maybe it's friends, maybe it's something else. What has God done for you? What are things that you have already in your hand? And what does it look like for you then to give from a grateful, thankful heart? What do you have? What does it look like to give from a thankful heart? And lastly, and third, Jesus isn't rushed, but here's the question: are you? Have you been rushed? Has the pressures of the world kind of lowered the priority? And the invitation is for you to be present with Jesus just as he longs to be present with you. To not be busy, to not be rushed, but to take some moment every day, some moments, to be present with a God who chooses to be present with you. Because you're right, there's probably a million other things that he would want to do, but the one thing about God is this, and we find in Jesus, that even under intense pressure, what he wants to do is care for you, is be generous with you, and to be present with you. Why don't you stand? We're going to respond in worship together as the band comes, but I'd love to just pray with you as we close off the service this morning. Jesus, there are a lot of things that go on in our life. There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of things that we're walking through. There's some who are unsure about you, some who are very sure about you. Just in this room, there's so many different things happening and going on. And it can feel a little intense. And sometimes we project who we are in rush and busyness on who you are. But this is a really good corrective lens for us to recognize that, Jesus, in a really good way, you are not like us. That in the midst of what seems that you'd be busy with, we find you who cares about the things we care about. So Lord, I pray that we would cast our cares on you. That we would know that you're the one who binds up wounds, that sets prisoners free, that brings freedom and life. Lord, I pray that in the busyness and a rush and all those things, that we take time to remember what you've given. Because if you could do that, then imagine what you can do tomorrow. God, help us to remind the things you've done. But Lord, also to be going, what does it look like for us? What do we need to give up in light of who you are and what you've done? Because we know you just never waste it. And lastly, Lord, in the busyness and a rush, Lord, help us to be present with you like you're present with us. Jesus, I'm thankful. This story just reminds us again of who you are. Amen.